They had been submerged for 41 days when the air finally turned thick enough to taste. Lieutenant Commander Reuben Whitaker stood in the conning tower of USS Flasher, watching his executive officer light a cigarette. The match flared 3 times before it caught. There wasn't enough oxygen left in the boat to sustain a clean flame. It was January 25, 1945. Flasher was running submerged in the South China Sea, approximately 80 miles west of Cape Varela, in what is now Vietnam. The submarine had not surfaced since December 15, 1944. 41 days. The crew had not seen sunlight, breathed fresh air, or stood on a deck that wasn't rolling beneath their feet in the confined space of a pressure hull for nearly 6 weeks. The boat smelled like a mixture of diesel fuel, human sweat, cooking grease, battery acid, and the peculiar metallic tang that comes from recycled air. Every surface was slick with condensation. The temperature hovered near 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the forward torpedo room, slightly cooler in the engine spaces where the ventilation was better, assuming you could call it ventilation. Men moved slowly, conserving oxygen and energy. They had learned not to exert themselves unnecessarily. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Whitaker had commanded Flasher since her commissioning in September 1943. This was the boat's 5th war patrol. In 4 previous patrols, Flasher had sunk 14 confirmed Japanese vessels, totaling over 60,000 tons. The submarine had earned a reputation as one of the most successful boats in the Pacific Fleet. But this patrol was different from anything Whitaker or his crew had experienced. The original orders had been straightforward. Depart Fremantle, Australia, on December 4, 1944. Proceed to patrol area in the South China Sea. Interdict Japanese shipping lanes between Singapore and the home islands. Standard patrol duration was expected to be 56 days total, with perhaps 20 to 25 days spent submerged in enemy-controlled waters. But the patrol had not gone according to plan. On December 15th, while running on the surface to recharge batteries during the night, Flasher's radar operator detected multiple contacts. Japanese anti-submarine patrol craft, likely responding to increased American submarine activity in the area. Whitaker ordered an emergency dive. The boat went under at 02:15 hours. She would not surface again for 62 days. The decision to remain submerged was not made all at once. It was a series of smaller decisions, each one extending the time underwater by another day, another week. Japanese patrol activity remained heavy throughout December. Every time Whitaker considered surfacing to recharge batteries and refresh the air, radar contacts appeared. Aircraft, surface vessels, sometimes both. Remaining submerged meant running on battery power exclusively. The submarine's 4 diesel engines, which normally provided propulsion and recharged the massive battery banks, sat silent. The batteries slowly drained. Each day submerged meant less reserve power for the next day. Each day meant the air grew thinner, the carbon dioxide levels climbed higher, and the lithium hydroxide canisters that scrubbed CO2 from the atmosphere grew less effective. USS Flasher was a Gato-class fleet submarine, hull number S-249. She was 311 feet, 9 inches long, with a beam of 27 feet, 3 inches. Her surface displacement was 1,526 tons. Submerged, she displaced 2,424 tons. The boat was designed for extended operations, far from friendly ports. She carried 24 torpedoes, 10 in tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, with 14 reloads stored throughout the boat. Her armament included a 5-inch, 25 caliber deck gun, a 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, and 2 20mm Oerlikon cannons, though these weapons were useless while submerged. Her propulsion system consisted of 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower. These engines could drive the submarine at 20 1/4 knots on the surface. Submerged, running on battery power alone, Flasher could manage 9 knots for short periods, or 2 to 3 knots for extended underwater operations. The critical limitation was the batteries. Gato-class submarines carried 2 battery banks, each consisting of 126 cells. These massive lead-acid batteries, weighing several tons each, were stored below the crew spaces in 2 separate compartments. They provided the electrical power for everything when submerged: propulsion motors, pumps, ventilation fans, lighting, radio equipment, sonar, and the carbon dioxide scrubbers that kept the air breathable. Under normal operating conditions, a fleet submarine could remain submerged for approximately 48 hours before the batteries were exhausted and the air became dangerous. Doctrine called for surfacing every night when possible, running the diesels to recharge batteries and exchange the stale air for fresh. A submarine on war patrol would typically spend 12 to 16 hours submerged during daylight, then surface after dark to run on diesels through the night. 62 days submerged was not supposed to be possible. The batteries couldn't hold enough charge, the air scrubbers couldn't remove carbon dioxide indefinitely, the crew couldn't survive that long without fresh air and the psychological relief of surfacing. The food wouldn't last, the fresh water would run out. A dozen different systems would fail from the constant moisture and lack of maintenance that required surfacing. But Whitaker and his crew were about to prove that doctrine, like so many things in war, was merely a guideline that could be exceeded when survival demanded it. The key was battery conservation. Instead of running at 3 knots continuously, Flasher crept along at 1 knot, barely maintaining steerage. Sometimes the boat simply sat on the bottom in shallow areas, completely motionless, all non-essential systems shut down. The crew developed routines that minimized power consumption. Lighting was reduced to absolute minimums. Only essential equipment operated. The air conditioning system, which normally kept the boat at a tolerable temperature, was shut down to conserve power. The temperature climbed into the 90s and stayed there. Condensation dripped from every surface, forming puddles that had to be mopped constantly to prevent electrical shorts. Ventilation fans, which circulated air through the boat, were run at reduced speeds or shut off entirely in some compartments. The air became stratified, with layers of different temperatures and oxygen concentrations. Men learned to stay in areas where the air was slightly better, or to move slowly to avoid gasping for breath. Flasher's crew numbered 73 men. They were volunteers, every one of them. Submarine service in the United States Navy was entirely voluntary. No one was assigned to submarines against their will. The men who served on boats like Flasher had chosen this duty knowing its dangers and discomforts. They were also the elite of the Navy. Submarine training was rigorous and extensive. Before assignment to a fleet boat, every crew member had completed basic submarine school at New London, Connecticut. There they learned the fundamentals: how submarines worked, emergency procedures, damage control, escape techniques. They learned to think in 3 dimensions, to understand that a submarine operated in an environment that could kill them instantly if they made mistakes. After submarine school came specialized training. Torpedomen learned to maintain, load, and fire the Mark 14 torpedoes that were the submarine's primary weapon. Electricians learned the complex systems that controlled everything from battery charging to motor operation. Enginemen learned to operate and repair the diesel engines and the intricate systems that supported them. Radiomen, sonarmen, quartermasters, cooks, and pharmacists' mates all received training specific to submarine operations. The officers attended additional schools. They studied navigation, tactics, engineering, and leadership. They learned to read sonar displays and radar screens. They practiced attack approaches in simulators, firing dummy torpedoes at mock targets until the calculations became instinctive. They studied Japanese merchant ship recognition, learning to identify vessels by their silhouettes at night or through a periscope at dawn. But no amount of training could fully prepare men for the reality of extended, submerged operations. The training manuals described 48 hours as the maximum safe duration underwater. They explained the symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning: headaches, dizziness, shortness of breath, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness and death. They described the safe limits for CO2 concentration in the air, no more than 1% for extended periods, with 2% being the absolute maximum for short durations. What the manuals didn't explain was what happened when you exceeded those limits day after day, week after week. What happened when the lithium hydroxide canisters that absorbed CO2 became saturated and stopped working effectively? What happened when there was no fresh air coming in and no way to get rid of the carbon dioxide except to spread out the absorption over time and hope the crew could tolerate slightly higher concentrations? The crew had been trained to believe they could trust their equipment, their boat, and their officers. They believed that Flasher was capable of accomplishing her mission and bringing them home safely. They believed that American submarines were technologically superior to anything the Japanese could field, that American training was better, that American tactics were more effective. These beliefs were not without foundation. American submarines in 1945 were devastatingly effective against Japanese shipping. They had sunk over 1,000 Japanese merchant vessels and hundreds of warships. They had cut off Japan's access to raw materials from Southeast Asia, strangling the island nation's war economy. Submarines accounted for 55% of all Japanese shipping losses, despite representing less than 2% of the US Navy's personnel. But effectiveness came at a cost. Submarine service was the most dangerous assignment in the American military. Of the 288 submarines that deployed on war patrols during World War II, 52 were lost with all hands. That was a loss rate of 18%, higher than any other branch of service. 1 in 5 submarines that left port never returned. The first week submerged was uncomfortable but manageable. The crew had experienced week-long submergence before, during previous patrols, when enemy activity made surfacing too dangerous. They knew the routine. Conserve battery power. Minimize movement. Accept the heat and humidity. Wait for the opportunity to surface. By December 22, 1944, 1 week into the extended dive, the air had begun to deteriorate noticeably. The carbon dioxide concentration measured 3%, well above the recommended maximum of 1%. Men complained of headaches. Some experienced nausea. Breathing required conscious effort rather than automatic reflex. Whitaker ordered the lithium hydroxide canisters changed more frequently. These cylindrical containers, approximately 2 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, were filled with a chemical compound that absorbed carbon dioxide from the air. Under normal conditions, a canister would last 24 to 36 hours before becoming saturated. Now, with CO2 levels climbing, they were being changed every 12 hours. The problem was that Flasher carried a limited supply of fresh canisters. They had been loaded for a 56-day patrol, with perhaps 25 days submerged. No one had anticipated needing to scrub the air continuously for 2 months. The supply officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Philip Garner, calculated that at the current rate of consumption, they would run out of fresh canisters by mid-January. The solution was to regenerate used canisters. The lithium hydroxide could be baked in the boat's ovens to drive off the absorbed carbon dioxide, theoretically restoring the canister's effectiveness. In practice, this process was inefficient and dangerous. Baking the canisters released concentrated CO2 into the boat, temporarily, making the air even worse. The regenerated canisters never worked as well as fresh ones, but it was better than nothing. Food became an issue earlier than expected. Flasher had been provisioned for 56 days with some reserve. Fresh food, stored in refrigerated compartments, was consumed first. Vegetables, fruit, eggs, and meat disappeared within the first 2 weeks. By early January, the crew was eating canned and dried rations exclusively. The cooks, working in a galley where the temperature exceeded 100 degrees, prepared meals that were nutritionally adequate but monotonous: canned corned beef, powdered eggs, dehydrated potatoes, beans, rice. The bread, baked fresh in the early days of patrol, had long since been consumed. Now they ate hardtack, the same dense crackers that had sustained sailors for centuries. Fresh water was rationed. The submarine carried enough for drinking and minimal cooking, but not for regular bathing. Showers were prohibited. Men washed themselves with damp cloths, using salt water when possible to conserve the fresh water supply. The smell of unwashed bodies added to the already overwhelming odor inside the boat. The heat was relentless. With the air conditioning shut down to conserve battery power, the interior temperature climbed and stayed high. The submarine's steel hull, surrounded by tropical seawater, conducted heat into the boat. The machinery, even at minimal operation, generated additional heat. The crew's bodies added more heat to the confined space. Men stripped down to shorts and nothing else. They moved as little as possible. Some crew members took to sleeping in shifts in the cooler areas of the boat, particularly near the torpedo tubes where the hull was thickest and the insulation slightly better. Others found spots near ventilation ducts where air movement, minimal as it was, provided some relief. Sleep became difficult. The combination of heat, poor air quality, and stress made rest elusive. Men lay in their bunks, 3 high in the crew berthing areas, gasping for breath in the thick air. The bunks closest to the ventilation had the best air, and these became coveted positions. Senior crew members asserted their privilege. Junior sailors took what was left. Whitaker himself slept fitfully when he slept at all. As commander, he felt responsible for every decision that had led to this situation. The choice to remain submerged had been his. Each day that passed without surfacing was his decision. If the crew suffered, if men died from carbon dioxide poisoning, or if the boat was lost because the batteries failed, it would be his responsibility. On January 3, 1945, 19 days into the extended submergence, Flasher's sonar operator detected propeller sounds, multiple contacts, moving slowly from west to east. A convoy. Whitaker faced an immediate decision. Engaging the convoy would require maneuvering into attack position, increasing speed, using precious battery power. It would require firing torpedoes, which would reveal the submarine's position and likely draw anti-submarine response. After the attack, Flasher would need to evade, running deep and fast, draining the batteries further. But this was why they were here. Flasher was on war patrol to sink Japanese ships. The crew had endured 19 days of hell specifically to remain in position to attack targets like this convoy. Whitaker ordered the approach. The submarine crept toward the convoy at 2 knots, barely faster than a walking pace. The sonar operator provided continuous bearings. The fire control party in the conning tower plotted the convoy's course and speed. Whitaker raised the periscope for brief observations, each look lasting only seconds to avoid detection. Through the periscope, he saw them. 6 Japanese merchant ships in 2 columns, escorted by 3 destroyers. The merchantmen were large vessels, probably tankers or cargo ships bringing vital supplies from Southeast Asia to Japan. Exactly the targets American submarines had been sent to destroy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Whitaker selected his targets, the 2 largest merchants in the near column. He ordered the forward torpedo tubes made ready. The torpedoman, working in the sweltering heat of the forward torpedo room, opened the outer doors on tubes 1 through 4. Water flooded the tubes with a distinct rushing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The firing solution came together. Range, bearing, target speed, target angle. The torpedo data computer, an electromechanical marvel that calculated the complex geometry of an underwater attack, provided the firing angles. Whitaker gave the order. 4 torpedoes launched from the forward tubes in sequence, each separated by 5 seconds. The Mark 14 torpedoes, each 20 feet long and weighing 3,200 pounds, left the tubes powered by electric motors. They ran at 46 knots, leaving trails of bubbles that marked their paths. The torpedoes were set to run at a depth of 10 feet, designed to strike the target ships below the waterline where the explosions would cause maximum flooding. Time to impact was calculated at 93 seconds for the first torpedo. Whitaker counted silently, watching through the periscope. At 90 seconds, he saw the first explosion. A column of water erupted alongside the leading merchant ship. 2 seconds later, a second explosion struck the same vessel amidships. The ship shuddered, listed, and began to settle. The second target was turning, trying to evade. The third torpedo missed, passing ahead of the bow. The fourth torpedo struck near the stern, the explosion severing the rudder and jamming the propeller shaft. The ship lost way, dead in the water. The escorts reacted immediately. The destroyers turned toward Flasher's position, increasing speed. Whitaker ordered deep and silent. The submarine's bow angled down. The crew secured all unnecessary equipment. Every man froze in place, barely breathing. The depth charges began falling 2 minutes later. The first patterns were poorly aimed, exploding several hundred yards away. The concussions rattled the boat, but caused no damage. The destroyers were searching, running back and forth over the area where the torpedoes had originated. Flasher went deep, descending to 400 feet, near the submarine's test depth. The pressure hull groaned under the stress. Small leaks appeared around valve stems and pipe fittings, spraying fine mists of seawater. The crew remained silent, listening to the sound of destroyer propellers overhead. The Japanese escorts dropped depth charges for 3 hours. Some patterns came close enough to throw men off their feet. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation fell from the overhead in chunks. A hydraulic line fractured, spraying oil across the maneuvering room. The crew plugged the leak with wooden plugs and rags, working silently while explosions shook the boat. At 400 feet, the air pressure inside the boat increased noticeably. Men's ears popped. Breathing became even more difficult, as the higher pressure made the already oxygen-depleted air harder to draw into the lungs. Some crew members showed signs of oxygen deprivation, bluish lips, confusion, difficulty concentrating. Whitaker ordered the boat to rise to 200 feet once the destroyer sounds faded. The ascent helped slightly with the air pressure, but the oxygen situation was becoming critical. The carbon dioxide concentration had spiked to 5% during the depth charge attack, when all air circulation had been stopped to minimize noise. The pharmacist's mate, the closest thing to a doctor the submarine carried, moved through the boat, checking on crew members. Several men were barely conscious, lying in their bunks struggling to breathe. Others showed signs of carbon dioxide poisoning, severe headaches, disorientation, muscle weakness. One young torpedo man had suffered a seizure during the attack, thrashing violently in his bunk until shipmates held him down. The battery charge was critical. The high-speed maneuvering during the attack and the 3-hour evasion at depth had drained the batteries to 20% capacity. At this level, the submarine barely had enough power to maintain depth and run minimal life support. There was no reserve for another attack or extended evasion. Whitaker called a meeting with his officers in the wardroom. They spoke in low voices, conserving oxygen. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander George Grider, laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The batteries would not last another week at current consumption rates. The air was borderline unbreathable. The crew was approaching the limits of endurance. The food would last perhaps another 3 weeks if rationed severely. Fresh water was adequate, but not abundant. They had 3 options. First, surface immediately, recharge the batteries and refresh the air, and accept the near certainty of being detected and attacked by Japanese patrol craft. Second, continue the current pattern, remaining submerged until the batteries or the crew gave out completely. Third, move to shallower water, sit on the bottom with all systems shut down except minimal life support, and wait for Japanese patrol activity to diminish. Whitaker chose the third option. Flasher moved to a shallow area with a sandy bottom at 180 feet depth. The submarine settled onto the bottom with a gentle bump. All propulsion stopped. The crew secured everything that made noise. They waited. For 3 days, Flasher sat motionless on the bottom. The only sounds were the quiet hum of carbon dioxide scrubbers and the occasional groan of the hull. Men whispered when they had to communicate. Most lay in their bunks, moving as little as possible. The temperature exceeded 100 degrees throughout the boat. The air was thick, heavy, almost liquid in its density. On January 7th, 23 days into the extended dive, sonar detected a single ship approaching from the northeast. Whitaker ordered the boat off the bottom, a process that required blowing small amounts of compressed air into the ballast tanks. Flasher rose slowly, reaching periscope depth after 20 minutes of careful buoyancy control. Through the periscope, Whitaker saw a Japanese tanker, perhaps 8,000 tons, traveling alone without escort. It was an opportunity too good to pass. He ordered an attack approach. 2 torpedoes fired. Both struck the tanker amidships. The vessel broke in half, sinking in less than 4 minutes. Flasher went deep immediately, not waiting to observe the results. There were no escorts to evade this time, but Whitaker took no chances. The submarine descended to 300 feet and crept away from the area at minimal speed. The attack had cost precious battery power. The charge level dropped to 15%, dangerously low. At this level, the submarine could maintain depth, control, and minimal life support for perhaps 48 hours. After that, the batteries would be dead, and Flasher would sink uncontrollably or be forced to surface regardless of enemy presence. The crew's physical condition deteriorated rapidly after the tanker attack. The exertion required for the attack approach, firing torpedoes, and evasion had consumed oxygen faster than the scrubbers could remove carbon dioxide. The CO2 concentration spiked to 6%, a level that would cause unconsciousness or death within hours under normal circumstances. Men lay in their bunks gasping for breath. Some lost consciousness. The pharmacist's mate moved through the boat with oxygen bottles, giving struggling crew members brief doses of pure oxygen from the emergency medical supplies. These bottles, intended for treating wounded men, became the only thing keeping some sailors alive. Lieutenant Commander Reuben reported to Whitaker that several crew members were approaching the point where they could no longer function. The torpedomen in the forward room were too weak to load weapons. The enginemen could barely monitor their equipment. Even the officers showed signs of severe oxygen deprivation, slurred speech, difficulty concentrating, delayed reactions. Whitaker himself felt the effects. His vision narrowed. His thoughts came slowly, as if travelling through thick syrup. He had to focus completely on each decision, working through mental fog to reach conclusions that should have been obvious. He knew that his judgment was impaired, that he might make mistakes that would kill everyone aboard, but there was no one to relieve him. He was the captain. The decisions were his alone. On January 9th, 1945, 25 days submerged, Flasher detected another, Convoy. This time Whitaker let it pass. The submarine no longer had the battery power for an attack approach. The crew no longer had the strength to man battle stations. They had reached the absolute limit of endurance. But surfacing remained impossible. Japanese patrol activity had actually increased in the South China Sea. Radio intercepts, monitored by Flasher's radioman listening on minimal power, indicated that the Japanese Navy had intensified anti-submarine operations in response to the recent merchant ship losses. Surface vessels and aircraft swept the area constantly, searching for the American submarines that were strangling Japan's supply lines. Whitaker made a decision that would define the rest of the patrol. Flasher would remain submerged regardless of battery charge or crew condition. They would sit on the bottom with all systems shut down except the absolute minimum needed to sustain life. They would spread out the remaining battery power over as many days as necessary, until Japanese patrol activity diminished enough to allow safe surfacing. It was a gamble with the crew's lives. At current carbon dioxide levels, men would begin dying within days. The oxygen bottles were nearly exhausted. The lithium hydroxide canisters, even with regeneration, were losing effectiveness. The crew was already weakened to the point where many could barely move. Extending the dive further might kill them all. But attempting to surface into the teeth of Japanese anti-submarine patrols would certainly result in Flasher's destruction. The boat was too weak to fight on the surface. The diesels, unused for 25 days, might not start immediately. The crew was too debilitated to man the deck guns effectively. A single Japanese patrol craft could destroy them. Flasher settled onto the bottom again, at 190 feet. All unnecessary systems shut down. The boat went completely dark, except for a few dim red lights in critical spaces. The temperature climbed above 105 degrees. Men stopped sweating because they had no moisture left to sweat. Dehydration, combined with oxygen deprivation to produce a state of semi-consciousness in many crew members. The next 2 weeks existed outside normal time. Days blurred together in the darkness and heat. Men lost track of whether it was day or night, January 10th or January 20th. Some hallucinated, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices in the silence. Others simply stared at the bulkheads, too exhausted to move or think. The watch schedule continued, maintained by the officers through sheer force of will. Someone had to monitor the gauges, ensure the scrubbers kept running, check the battery charge, listen for approaching ships. The watches rotated every 4 hours, though the men standing watch often simply remained at their posts because moving required more energy than they had. Food consumption dropped to minimal levels. The cooks continued preparing meals. Though most crew members could barely eat, the thick air made swallowing difficult. Nausea was universal. Some men forced down a few bites of canned rations each day. Others subsisted on water alone, drinking as much as they could to combat the dehydration. The water supply became critical. Fresh water was rationed to 1 quart per man per day, barely enough for drinking in the extreme heat. Some crew members supplemented this by drinking distilled water produced by the submarine's evaporators, which converted seawater to fresh water. But running the evaporators consumed battery power, so this option was severely limited. Lieutenant Garner, the supply officer, maintained meticulous records of consumption. He calculated that if they continued at current ration levels, the food would last until mid-February. The water might last until early March if they operated the evaporators for 2 hours each day. But the batteries would die long before then, probably within the next week based on current discharge rates. Whitaker ordered even more extreme conservation measures. All lighting except battle lanterns was extinguished. The carbon dioxide scrubbers ran at half speed, removing less CO2 but consuming less power. Ventilation fans shut down completely in most compartments. The crew was ordered to remain in their bunks except when absolutely necessary. The boat became a tomb. Men lay in their bunks in complete darkness, listening to their own laboured breathing and the occasional groan of the pressure hull. Some prayed. Others wrote letters they knew would never be mailed, scratching words on scraps of paper in the darkness. A few sang quietly, old songs from before the war, memories of a world that seemed impossibly distant. On January 15th, 31 days submerged, a sailor in the after torpedo room died. Electrician's mate second class Robert Morrison simply stopped breathing during his sleep. The pharmacist's mate examined him and determined that carbon dioxide poisoning, combined with dehydration and heat exhaustion, had caused his heart to fail. He was 23 years old, from a small town in Iowa. Morrison's body was wrapped in canvas and placed in the after torpedo room, where the temperature was slightly cooler. Navy regulations required burial at sea, but surfacing was impossible. The body would have to remain aboard until they could safely surface. No one knew when that would be. The death affected the crew profoundly. Until that moment, despite the suffering and deprivation, most men had believed they would survive. They trusted their boat, their captain, their own endurance. Morrison's death made it real. They could die here, in the darkness and heat, suffocating slowly while their submarine sat on the bottom of the South China Sea. Whitaker gathered the crew, or as many as could move, in the forward torpedo room. He spoke briefly, his voice hoarse from the bad air. Morrison had served honourably. He had done his duty. They would honour his memory by completing the patrol and bringing Flasher home. They would survive because Morrison would have wanted them to survive. On January 23rd, 1945, 39 days after the emergency dive, sonar reported that Japanese patrol activity had decreased noticeably. The constant sounds of propellers and depth charge attacks that had characterized the previous weeks had diminished. Radio intercepts suggested that Japanese anti-submarine forces had shifted their focus to other areas. Whitaker made the decision to attempt surfacing. The batteries were at 8% charge, barely enough to blow the ballast tanks and bring the boat up. If the diesels failed to start, if Japanese patrol craft appeared, if anything went wrong, Flasher would sink and never rise again. The crew prepared for surfacing with movements so slow they seemed to be underwater already. Men climbed to their surface stations, leaning on bulkheads for support. The lookouts, who would be first on deck, stood ready at the bottom of the conning tower ladder. The enginemen positioned themselves at the diesel controls, hoping the engines would fire after 39 days of silence. At 2200 hours on January 23rd, Whitaker gave the order. Compressed air hissed into the ballast tanks. The submarine began to rise. The depth gauge unwound, 150 feet, 100 feet, 75 feet. At 40 feet, Whitaker raised the periscope for a quick look. The sea was empty. Dark water, no moon, no contacts. Flasher broke the surface at 22:15 hours. The conning tower hatch opened. Fresh air rushed into the boat like a physical force. The first men on deck gasped and almost fell, overwhelmed by the sudden abundance of oxygen. Below, crew members sobbed with relief as clean air flowed through the boat. The diesels started on the first attempt, their roar seeming impossibly loud after weeks of near silence. The engines caught, steadied, and began, charging the batteries with a reassuring hum. Ventilation fans started, pulling the foul air from the boat and replacing it with air that tasted sweet and clean. Men stumbled onto the deck, desperate to feel wind and see sky. Some vomited immediately, their bodies rejecting the sudden change. Others simply stood, faces turned upward, breathing deeply. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright after 39 days in darkness. Whitaker remained on the bridge, scanning the horizon with binoculars while the boat recharged. They needed at least 6 hours on the surface to bring the batteries to operational level. Every minute they remained surfaced risked detection, but there was no choice. The batteries were dead. They had to charge. The crew worked through the night. The cooks prepared the first hot meal in weeks. The enginemen performed maintenance on equipment that had run continuously for 39 days. The torpedomen restowed weapons and cleaned the torpedo rooms. The body was brought on deck and committed to the sea with brief ceremony at 0300 hours. By dawn on January 24th, Flasher was combat-ready again. The batteries were at 70% charge. The air was fresh. The crew, though still exhausted and weakened, could function. Whitaker ordered the boat to dive and continue the patrol. Over the next 38 days, Flasher sank 13 more Japanese vessels. The submarine attacked convoys with methodical precision, firing torpedoes, evading escorts, and moving on to the next target. The crew, hardened by their 39-day ordeal, operated with grim efficiency. They surfaced at night to recharge, dove during the day to hunt, and avoided the extended submergence that had nearly killed them. On February 17th, 45 days after surfacing from the extended dive, Flasher received orders to return to base. The patrol had lasted 62 days total. In that time, the submarine had sunk 15, confirmed, Japanese vessels totaling over 94,000 tons, making it one of the most successful patrols of the Pacific War. Flasher arrived at Fremantle on February 25th, 1945. The crew came ashore, gaunt, hollow-eyed, 20 to 30 pounds lighter than when they had departed. Medical examinations revealed widespread malnutrition, dehydration, and the lingering effects of prolonged carbon dioxide exposure. Several crew members required hospitalization. All needed extended rest. The patrol report, submitted by Whitaker and reviewed by submarine force commanders, detailed the extended submergence and its effects. Navy medical researchers studied the data, trying to understand how men had survived conditions that should have killed them. The information helped establish new protocols for submarine operations and emergency procedures for extended dives. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. 15 ships sunk. 94,000 tons destroyed. 39 consecutive days submerged, a record that stood throughout the war. These were facts that could be recorded and analysed. What couldn't be quantified was what the crew had learned about themselves and about war. They had discovered that human endurance extends far beyond what manuals and training suggest. They had learned that survival sometimes requires accepting conditions that seem impossible to survive. They had proven that determination and discipline could sustain men through circumstances that should have broken them. They had also learned the cost of such endurance. Morrison's death haunted the crew. Several men suffered psychological effects that lasted years after the war. Nightmares of suffocating in darkness, panic attacks in enclosed spaces, an inability to tolerate heat or humidity. These were the invisible wounds of 39 days underwater. For Whitaker, the patrol's success brought commendation and promotion. Flasher received the Presidential Unit Citation. Individual crew members received medals for their performance, but Whitaker knew that he had pushed his men to the absolute limit of human endurance and beyond. One man had died. Others had been permanently affected. The line between heroic determination and reckless endangerment was thin, and he had walked it for 39 days. USS Flasher continued operations through the end of the war, completing 6 war patrols total. The submarine sank 21 confirmed vessels, ranking her among the most successful American submarines of World War II. After the war, Flasher served briefly in the reserve fleet before being decommissioned and eventually scrapped. The crew dispersed, returning to civilian life and carrying with them memories of 62 days in the South China Sea. Most never spoke publicly about the extended dive. The patrol report remained classified for decades. Only in recent years have historians compiled the full story from declassified documents and interviews with surviving crew members. The patrol demonstrated something fundamental about submarine warfare and about human limits. It proved that determined men could survive conditions far worse than doctrine suggested possible. It showed that American submarines could operate in the most hostile waters, evading enemy patrols, while continuing to sink shipping. It revealed that industrial warfare was not just about technology and production, but about the human beings who operated the machines and endured the consequences. 40 submariners stayed underwater for 62 days and sank 15 Japanese ships because they had no other choice. They endured heat, darkness, bad air, and near starvation because surfacing meant death. They survived because their training, their equipment, and their determination combined to push human endurance beyond known limits. And one man died because even determination has limits that cannot be exceeded. This is the story. That gets lost in the statistics of tonnage sunk and patrols completed. This is the human cost of success in submarine warfare. This is what it meant to serve on USS Flasher during the 5th War Patrol. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.